Welcome back. We're starting a new series looking at the renovation of this conservatory space. Today we're fitting the floor. If that sounds interesting, stick around. So this is a space we're going to be working in for the next few episodes. You can see we've got a large conservatory here. We've got an arch that takes us into what used to be a small dining area. Customers had this rather nice roof fitted, and now it's our turn to do the finish joinery. A few jobs we're going to look at on this series. First and foremost, we're going to be fitting a wooden floor. We're then going to be fitting the skirting boards all the way round. We're putting some casework around the arch, and just around the corner there's going to be a new door and new architrave around the door. So I thought this would be interesting to share with you. So let's start. So just to forewarn you, we're obviously going to have some challenges with the lighting on this project. This is not a studio, it's not the workshop where I've put lights in for videos, so we've got to go with what we have. So I apologise if sometimes it's a bit dark. I'll do what I can in post-production, but let's live with that. I've already gone ahead and put the underlay down. I'm using a pretty high quality underlay. This is called TimberTech 2. And this particular underlay, it's got a silver side that goes down, and that's a moisture barrier. And then this sort of fibre material gives me both sound reduction and also thermal insulation. And that's important because underneath here is a concrete floor. So I want that moisture protection, and I also want that thermal insulation. So we've gone for a really high grade of underlay. I've laid it down. You can see the silver strips where I've joined it together. I've joined it together with a barrier proxy tape. Don't be tempted to use gaffer tape on this one. That doesn't give you the moisture properties that you're looking for, and over time moisture will penetrate through that and it will damage the floor surface. So what you're looking for is an aluminium tape that's perfectly got the vapor barrier protection on it, and that's what we've used. I'm approaching the job in two halves, so I'm going to do this half first, and as you can see here I've got my various tool stations set up that we're going to use, and once I've got this half done I'll move around and then I'll do that half of the conservatory. First thing I want to do is to think about the layout of the floor. So the camera is now in the dining area, and you can see that the archway frames up the conservatory. So I want the floor to be symmetrical down the centre of the room. So I'm not going to start at one of the sides and work across, because that wouldn't give me the symmetry that I'm looking for on this job. I have two centre points that the eye is going to see as it flows through this room. When you enter the room, your eye is going to be drawn through the arch to the conservatory, and therefore the floor wants to allow the eye to do that and lead to the centre point of the room. So I'm going to put this floor in centrally, work out from the centre so it's symmetrical either side. So my two centre points will be the centre point of this arch here and the centre point of this window here, which is this window frame. So I'm going to go ahead and use a chalk line to mark out the centre of this floor. This wall is coming in at 1,340 millimetres. So 1,340 divided by 2 is 670. So I take a mark here of 670 millimetres, which is there. And I'll just double check that measurement. Yep, that's looking good to me. And then I'll just by eye line that up to make sure I'm happy with it. And yes, yep, and that looks good to me. I then want to take a second measurement and find the centre point of the archway. And that's coming in at 1760. 1760. 1760 divided by 2 equals 880. So I now want to line up a mark here, 880, which is there. And I want to make this mark quite bold so I can see it. So I've now got the centre point of my arch and the centre point of the window. So I'm going to use a chalk line onto that point, onto this point, and continue that down into this room, and that's going to give me the baseline I'll be working to. And now I can line up the chalk line with that centre point in the arch, and I know I'm centred down there, and then I can snap a line. So this chalk line now gives me a reference point, and from there I can work out either way from that reference point, and I'm guaranteed to have symmetry in my joints inside this conservatory room. And that's important for this layout. Your layout might be different and you may not want to do that, and typically people will start at one wall and work across. Don't want to do that here because I need that symmetry because of the way the eye will take you into the room. Next job is to work out how I want to lay out the floor, and for a very good reason I'm going to start in that room. Now you can see I've actually taken all the architrave off the doors, and I've also taken all the skirting board off. So this job is somewhat easier. But typically when you're laying the floor, your floor here is going to go underneath the door frame, and you cut a small section out, and that just allows the boards to go underneath there, so the architrave comes down and cuts up the joint. Now for that reason, this is actually the hardest piece on the entire job to fit. If you leave this to last and we start in the centre and we move along, we are going to be trying to clip a piece of board in here and at the same time slide it underneath that door frame. And trust me, that won't work. So I want to put this piece in first and then work away from that. But I want to be parallel to the chalk line that we've made, otherwise my symmetry won't work inside the conservatory. So I now want to take some boards and just lay out so I can work out what this gap is going to look like. What I'm looking for is the size of this gap here, and I want that gap to obviously be less than the width of a board, but I don't want it to be too narrow. On this particular job, we're using a centre point in the room to line up. We're not using the wall as a reference area. So there's no guarantee that these walls all the way through are parallel to our centre line. The centre line was from a window point and the arch, not from the walls. Now it's going to look pretty close. To give you an example, that's 17 there and that's 16.5 there. So this wall is running out of plumb from our centre line. Now if we have a wider joint here, when I put the skirting board on, I can start to lose that variance. If I have a narrow gap here, then the edge of the skirting board, when fitted, will be in close proximity to the natural join of the board. And that will amplify any variance that we have in terms of this being parallel to the wall. So I'm looking for a sizable chunk here, because your eye will then lose that for you as you come in. So if we get that right, and we have, that's a nice size joint, I'm going to walk into this room from this door. My eye is going to be drawn through the arch into the conservatory and then to the outside, and I'll be symmetrical around the arch, and that's what people are going to see. So it's well worthwhile taking a little bit of time now to sort of weigh this up so you can understand what you're going to do. Now the other thing is, this is going to be my first board, and I want to bring the first board up to this wall. So I can now visually see how long that joint is going to be here when I come to join that board. And I don't want that too short, and that's going to be okay. And to maximise the wood, the offcuts that we have starts to position on the next row. And that way you maximise your material, you get a random pattern that looks quite pleasing, and I still get that symmetry around the arch that I'm looking for. So with that said, I now need to cut a piece of wood that's going to just slide underneath this door here, but is going to give me an expansion gap against this wall here. So this is the board that we're going to fit. And I know that I want this part of the board to join to the floor in the other room. We'll look at that in a second. So I want to put a cut that's going to come in underneath this architrave, and I can see where that's going to join there. So I can score a line across this, not all the way, but somewhere around about there, and I know that's the piece that I want to cut out. And similarly on this side, I can come here underneath this piece and that's the piece that I want to cut out. So the question now is, how long has this board got to be to join to the other room, and how wide has this got to be so it fits into this piece? I'm going to leave a 6mm expansion gap around this room, and I'm using these spacers that are 6mm to give me that. So I'll put the spacer in, and then I'll butt the board up against that spacer, and that will give me the 6mm I'm looking for. So I now want to measure from that 6mm here, and that's going to be round about 170mm at that point there, and I know this board is parallel to the centre of my room. That's roughly the end of my board. So at this end, this board wants to be round about 158. So I know this end of the board here wants to be 170 from this back edge. So 170 is there. And I know at this end it wants to be 158. 158, and I just mark the waist side just so I don't get myself confused. This end here wants to be 161. 161. And the final measurement is from this edge here to this adjoining floor. And this wants to be 200. So now we can take this into our makeshift workshop and we can cut this to size. And I'm just coming in now with my Festool guide rail and just drawing in that shape. And now I can visually see what I'm doing. I'm cutting out this area here, I'm cutting out across here, and then I'm cutting out this area here. However, I want to put a small chamfer at this end here, so I don't want to come in with a sharp angle. I want to give that a chamfer across there, a bit like that. And that's so when the architrave comes down, there is still enough material here to hide any gaps underneath the architrave, and similarly on this joint here as well. So, now I can cut this out. The easiest way to cut this profile out is with a spade bit. So bring your spade bit up to the edge and just mark where the point is going to be. And then square that line down. Bring it up to your next edge and mark where the point is going to be. And bring that line down, and then where those lines cross and intersect is where you're going to drill your hole for your spade bit, and that's going to give you a nice arc in this corner, and then we can cut these pieces into that hole. This is a 22mm cutter I'm using here, and now I'm just going to flip this over and finish the hole from the other side, and that will just stop me blowing out the back of the board. Doesn't matter if you do, but I like things to be neat. I quite like the Japanese pull saws for this. And that gives me this really nice profile that will fit nicely underneath the architrave. Simples. Now this next cut is going to be harder because obviously it's longer and there's no way that my saw is going to make this cut for me. I'll get away with this one, which is great, but this one we're going to use the track saw for. And similarly for this one here, we'll also use the track saw. But we'll use the same technique to lay out this first hole, and we'll use the spade bits to cut the hole out. And with that one cut, I can then just come in and use the plunge saw to finish this off. Drop the two 6mm shims in place, and that should all close up quite nicely, and it does. So that's a good fit. And with the skirting boards on, the architrave on, that will hide that nicely, and I've still got that room for expansion. So with the first piece cut, I can now go ahead and look at the second piece. Before I do that, I just want to measure up to make sure that this is parallel with this piece. So I've got 25.2 at this end, and I have 25.2 at that end. So I've got my 6mm gap, that's fitted under the door. It's parallel to these pieces that are lined up to the centre point. Pretty bang on. So it's worthwhile taking time to get that first piece right on the floor. Now I can put this piece in, and now I've got a reference point at this side of the room that's parallel to the centre, and then I can just go ahead and fit the floor as you would normally. So it takes a bit of time to do, but hey, it's well worth doing it. Now until we get some weight on the floor, these pieces will float around a little bit. So we want to keep checking for the parallel. 24.7, 24.7. So kicked out a little bit at this end here. So push that back in, there you go, that's what's gone wrong. So that's now 25, and this end here is now 25. Now we can measure the width of this board. First thing I'm going to do is cut a board to length though, because remember I want to be able to use the offcuts to start off my next run. So we know we want a 6mm spacer at the end. Check. So the length of this board needs to be 873 here, 871 here. Sorry, 872. So I've got 872 and 871, which is neither here nor there. So we'll cut this to 871, and then we'll trim it down to width. Alright, and this end it wants to be 142. So the board's going to go in this way. So from this edge, I want 142, and I want 148. 142. And from this edge, 148. This one now slots in here, make sure it's flush. Good. Now the offcut that we had now starts the next row. Like that. So now with a run in place, it's beginning to give me a parallel edge. We can now start to use relative dimensioning to mark the rest of these boards out. This is the edge of the board I want to keep, it goes into that slot. Now I can take a direct measurement from this board here where I want the joint, which is there, and now I can just trim this off at the chop saw, and we should be good to go. So I've just worked across, got the first 4 rows in now. Exactly the same technique. We measure it to length, we cut it, we use the offcut to start the other end, and we've worked across. You'll find when you're first starting off that it's a bit tricky. The boards aren't fully interlocked, so they move around. So it's a bit of messing to get it locked. But once you get to this sort of stage and things are locked in, we're in good shape. Now I've reached an interesting part of the job because I've reached this archway. So I need to cut out a section of this board that allows me to fit this piece into the arch. Now before we measure anything, I want to make sure that this floor is still parallel to the centre part of the room, because obviously I've been banging it and moving it and fitting it, so there's a good chance that this floor has just twisted slightly out of true. I still have the 6mm shims around the room, so in theory it should be parallel, but before I mark this and cut it, I just want to check that. 7, 3, 8. So it's worked. So this floor is still parallel to my centre line. So I know it's now parallel, 7, 3, 8 to the centre line from the measured edge of the board. So I now know I can go ahead and mark this piece out to slot in. This is obviously the distance that we need, and all things being equal, that should be parallel now as well. And that is, let's call it 17, and this of course should be 17. So everything's looking good. I can come with my square and I can just mark to the end of this board. I know that's 6mm, and I can just put that across. So that's 1/2 of my mark done. On this side I put a 6mm shim in. Slide up to that, and now I can mark up that side of the board. I'm just taking this measurement here, and that looks good, so that now needs to be that deep plus some expansion joint 6mm. So with that done, we can now cut this out like that, and that's pretty good. So after I drop the cut piece in, what I've gone ahead and done is to finish off the floor to the middle of the room. But you'll notice I've not yet done this area here, and there's a very good reason for that. You may be tempted, once you've got this piece in, to work backwards into that wall and get this section done. The problem with that is the floor isn't supported, it's not yet locked together, so you end up with a run of material here that can actually flex against each other. And as you're doing that part of the floor, you'll find that that will begin to flex. And because you've no room to move when you get up to the wall, it's very hard to adjust that. And you'll find you'll end up with micro hairs between the joints of the boards. And it's all because this floor is not yet locked and it's flexing. So avoid the temptation to work into the corner. Instead, work out and get your line and make sure everything's nice and plumb and square, and we are here to that centre line, and then go back and fit it. And it'll still be awkward as you get to the walls, but you're not fighting the floor. The floor's not got flex in it, so you'll be in a lot better shape. So I'm now going to fill in this part of the floor and work back from this now solid floor into the wall. And I want to start at this end and work in that direction as I do this, and that just makes the joints on the floor a little bit easier. You'll also notice I've got a couple of backing boards here. There's one here and there's one just down there out of sight, and that was just to keep the board square as I was flicking out into the centre of the room. So obviously they're not going to be there, they kick out of the way when we're ready. So I now want to work out how I can get this angle here. There's a variety of ways you can do that. If you're going in with a full board length, you can just simply measure it, so you can work out what the distance from the end of the board to this part of the wall will be, distance from the end of the board to this part of the wall will be, measure that in and give you an angle, and that's the most accurate way of doing it. You could use a mitre gauge, so adjustable mitre gauge, and just take the dimensions off this wall and use that, or a very, very similar idea, I'm going to use the angle finder that came with the Festool Capex. So we adjust it, bring it into the corner, lock it down. And that's the angle that we're now going to use. So I'm using the offcut that came from the last run, and I just want to put the angle across here. Come in with a mitre gauge, put the lasers on, and then you're just looking for the lasers to run down the edge of that material. And it's not going to be bang on either, that's good. So that's the angle of the cut. I then want to make sure that I'm going to cut the angle in the right direction. So I orientate the board in the way it's going to be onto the floor. So that end flows down the room. That way, this end here goes into the wall. And then I can just visualise on the wall the angle that I want to take. So now I know my angle. I'm just going to line up the outside of the lasers with just shy of the corner of the material, and then that will come through and give me the angle that we need. Now this will not reach the full width of these particular boards in this angle position, so we'll cut as much as we can and we'll come back in with the Japanese pull saw to finish that off. Can you see the burn that we had here on the edge of this wood? That's because this is the universal blade that came with it, and it's not 100% designed for this, and this is really tough to cut, and even the Capex struggles. I mean, it gives us a nice job, but on these angles where I'm plunging into the centre of a piece of board, you can see how that burns. So there you go, that fits. I'm going to go ahead now and finish off fitting the floor into the wall. And we'll come back together when we've done that, and we'll talk about where we go next. Okay, so I've got this area pretty much finished now. I just now need to cut into the walls, and I'm just looking at the cutouts on this door. What I want to do is to have a joint halfway through the door, and that's just going to make it easier for me to fit. If this is a solid piece, it's really hard to get any pressure inside to close up this joint. If I make this two pieces, i.e. a joint in the middle, that makes that somewhat easier. So I'm just lining up where I want this to be. I've got a joint here on this area, I've got a joint here on this area, and then the next one's down there. So I'm just going to put this joint to be visually halfway between the two. And then when I do the joining in the door, I'll probably offset that one there, and that'll give me a nice pattern to run in. So I need to work out where I'm going to cut this. So if that's my wall joint there, then I'll just do a 6mm cut on that side. So this is where my board's going to come up to if I lay it out like this. So that's going to be the end of my board there. So from wall to the end of my board is 150mm. So if I make that 145, that will give me a bit of expansion gap. So we'll make this end 145, and here on this joint, this is coming in at 152. So we'll make this 146, and that'll give me an expansion joint there. Now with that lined up, I can now use a jigsaw to make this cut and the plunge saw to make this cut. So there we go, job's half done. Half the floor's all the way in now. It's all fitted around the edges. It's fitted to the door, which looks quite nice. Small bit of plastic trim once I get around to the skirting board in this room, and more importantly, it's centered and it's parallel to that chalk line that we made at the beginning of the project. Next job is I'm going to put some covers down on this side, move all my working surface to this side, get the next set of membranes down, and then I can crack on to do the other half of the floor. And that's pretty much the same as this side. It's actually easier because we're now going in the right direction. We're not trying to clip underneath as we did on this side of the floor as we finished off this space. So I can now work into the other side of the conservatory. Starting at this end, I'll be doing full runs all the way along. As I take an offcut at that end, that will start the next run, and therefore we can maximise the material we've got left, and I'll work into that space. Then I'll come in and I'll work into that space in there. Yeah. Next stage. there we have it. The floor is finished. We've tied it up. I've moved away the equipment we're not going to need on the next phase. And it's looking really, really good. It took about 2.5 days in the end to do the floor. Nothing really tricky. I think last time we were together, I was halfway through. This side was exactly the same, cutting to length, alternating the pieces and fitted into the wall. It's worked out really, really well. It's symmetrical. The arch is looking good, exactly as I wanted it on the floor. I'll show you that when we come to do the arch. And what I've just done here, just dropped a piece of the skirting board in, just leaning against the wall. It's not fitted, and hopefully you can see how that's looking parallel to those lines, and that's what I was talking about, that wide gap for. So yeah, that's it. So the next job is the arch. We'll look at that on the next episode. See you soon.